First unit review, we are going to be looking at Units 1 and Units 2 combined. These are some of the items we learned earlier in the year, and you've probably forgotten them. Therefore, you will need to spend a few extra minutes reviewing all of the information included in Units 1 and Units 2. Enjoy! The first item we will be looking at today are the different forms of government you need to be familiar with. And we'll start out looking at confederacies, where the local and state governments have lots of power. Then we'll move on to a confederacy opposite, unitary government, where the national government has much more power than the local and state governments. And then we get to what we have in the United States, a federal system whereby power is divided and shared between the local, state, and national levels. The first type of government we're looking at today are Confederate governments. And if you look at the image down here, you can tell that the idea of power, the concept of power, is pointing towards the state governments. Because in a Confederate government, the states have more power than the weak national government. The second form of government we're looking at is a unitary government. Una, if you look at the words UNI, in Spanish uno means one. Well, in a unitary government, the power is going towards the national government because there's only one national government in a country. And in a unitary government, the national government has much more power than the weakly, powerless state and local governments. The most important form of government you will need to know and be familiar with on your HSA is our federal form of government. And the reason why the federal form is the most important government you need to know is because the United States uses a federal government. Now, we looked at a Confederate government where the states have more power. We just looked at a unitary government where the national government has more power. And so we come to a federal form of government where power is divided and shared among the local and state and national governments. So you see power pointing towards the national government. You see power going towards the state government. That's because in some cases the national government has some powers, in some cases the state governments have powers, and in many cases the powers are shared and divided. In the United States, we have a limited form of government, meaning that people are supposed to have more power than the physical government. Limited types of government, like the United States, traditionally are democracies. Democracy is a Greek word. It comes from the first part here, demos, meaning people, and then the phrase kratos means rule. So if you put it together, people rule. And that's what democracy is all about. If you look at the imagery here, you'll notice that you see campaign buttons and stickers asking people to vote. And in a democracy, people have the ability to control their government through the vote. We're going to be looking at a couple different types of democracy. We're going to be looking and comparing representative democracy versus direct democracy. That should ring a bell. It should sound familiar. And then we're going to look at presidential democracies versus parliamentary democracies. You'll notice one of these items in each row is underlined. Can you take a hint on why these are underlined? In a direct democracy, all people decide on individual issues. Think about if you're in a classroom and everybody in the classroom is going to decide what we're going to eat for lunch today. Everybody is going to be making a decision. This sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't work. It really depends on the size of the country, the size of the population you're working with. In the United States, we utilize something called an indirect or representative democracy. Another word is also a republic. In a representative democracy, because we have 300 million people in this country, and it would be really, really hard for all 300 million of them to vote directly on all the bills that go to Congress and the Maryland General Assembly and the Prince George's County Council daily. We elect others, representatives, who decide and vote on the issues that are important to the people. In a parliamentary democracy, the legislative branch here has a tremendous amount of power. What happens here, first, voters go to the polls and they elect people. And the people they are electing are the legislative branch. After the legislative branch is elected, the legislative branch then decides who is going to be the chief executive. Now you'll notice here the voters only vote once. The voters only vote for the members of the legislative branch. And the legislative branch votes for the chief executive, whether he or she is a prime minister or a president. Many countries use this model, including Great Britain and Israel. Both are democracies, but they do their democracies a little bit different than the way we do ours. Now you're probably thinking, we don't have a parliament in the United States. What we have in the United States is a presidential democracy. And the reason why it's called a presidential democracy is because voters not only vote for members of the legislative branch, voters also vote in separate elections for a chief executive. Now at the national level, our chief executive is the president, but we also at the state and county level vote for mayors and county executives and governors separately from our legislators. In a presidential democracy, you'll notice how the legislative branch and the chief executive are not on the same plane. The legislative and chief executive are separated, and thus we get this concept called separation of powers, where the legislative branch has its own responsibilities, the executive branch has its own responsibilities. And this is something we're going to learn more about when we get to the principles of the United States government. In this section, we're going to be looking at unlimited governments. In an unlimited government, the government can do whatever it wants. The power in an unlimited government is unlimited. The government has unlimited power. It can do whatever it wants. And so phrases and adjectives like corrupts, cruel, mean, unfair, those types of words come to describe the types of government we're about to look at. The first type of unlimited government we're going to look at here is a monarchy. And you've probably heard of the word monarch. You're probably even more familiar with the words either king or queen. In a monarchy, you have one leader, but what makes a monarch different from other types of unlimited governments is the fact that a monarch doesn't fight for their power. A monarch simply inherits their power when they're born. Today, in the early 21st century, we don't have too many monarchs anymore. One of the most famous monarchs is King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. The next type of unlimited government is dictatorship, or sometimes we refer to them as autocratic governments. In a dictatorship, we have one leader, just like a monarchy, but what makes a dictator different is that a dictator has to struggle to get power. Usually there's a war or some type of major conflict that leads to a dictatorship. For example, Saddam Hussein took over Iraq in the mid-20th century, in the 60s and 70s, after a long war. Third type of unlimited government are oligarchies. And in an oligarchy, you have a small group of people that rule the country. Not too many oligarchies pan out. Usually when you have more than one person in charge, they often fight, have a war, and kill each other, and it gets messy. However, totalitarian governments have existed for many years and continue to exist. A very simple way to remember totalitarian is to look at the first 5 letters, the word total. The word total means everything. And in a totalitarian government, the government has complete control over people's lives. Going back into history, Adolf Hitler's Germany, Benito Mussolini's Italy. Going to today, you can make arguments that in Cuba, the Castro regime, in China, the communist government there, in North Korea, Kim Jong-il, his government. These types of governments have total control over the people's lives, meaning that the people have very few liberties or freedoms. In the next few slides, we will be moving away from government and looking at the role of economics in our daily lives, as well as government's interactions with our daily economy. One of the most important economic principles that you will find on the HSA is the idea of opportunity cost. Quite simply, opportunity cost is what you could be doing instead of what you are actually doing. And if you look at the background image in this slide, you see a gentleman and he's got door A, he's got door B, and he doesn't know which door to pick. Now, if the guy picks door A, his opportunity cost would be door B. Another example, right now, you are studying for the government HSA. That is your choice, okay? The opportunity cost would be any of the other things that you could be doing. For instance, you could be studying for the biology HSA, you could be baking your teacher a wonderful and delicious cake, you could be watching TV, you could be reading a book, you could be playing outside. As you can see, there are limitless answers for opportunity cost. In the following next slides, we're going to be looking at the different types of economic systems that each government and country use. And there isn't necessarily one that is better than the other. It just depends on the people and the government's desires on how they want their economy to be. Each of these 3 systems answer 3 questions. What to produce, for whom to produce the product or service for, and how to produce, how to make something. And depending upon which economic system you look at, each system will answer these 3 questions very differently. What I did here is I included an HSA Practice question that comes up sometimes on unit tests or old HSA exams. The Question reads, a company decides to install more machines and lay off some of its workers. Now, some of you might be wondering, what the heck is a layoff? A layoff is a fancy way of saying firing. So a company here is deciding to use more machines, fire some of its workers. The question gets to, which economic question is being directly addressed? Is it A, how to produce, B, what to produce, C, for whom to produce? Give you a few seconds to think this over. Hopefully you'll get the right answer. Alright, stop thinking. What's the correct answer? Well, if you're installing more machines and getting rid of its people, the workers, then you are deciding how to produce something. You've decided that it's much more cost effective to use machines, therefore you're saying sayonara to all the people you've employed for many, many years. There are four main types of economies that you need to be familiar with in the government HSA. They include traditional, command, market, and what we have in the United States, a mixed market economy. And you'll notice on this graphic organizer, each one of these economic systems answers those three questions. What to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. And the answer on who decides those questions is different depending upon each type of economy. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in the next few pages. The first type of economy you need to be familiar with is the most basic type of economy, what is called a traditional economy. And if you look at this image right here, you'll notice that the people in this image are farming. When you see a question on the HSA asking about farming or agriculture, it's usually about a traditional economy, because traditional economies are not highly industrialized. Traditional economies are based upon habits, traditions, and customs that communities and families have been doing for many, many years. So when we look at these three questions of what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce, all of these questions are being answered by the customs and habits that have been going on for many, many generations. In a command economy, you'll notice how I use my command voice. The government is making every economic decision. Earlier, we learned about the word totalitarian, and in a totalitarian government, the government has total control. Well, in a command economy, the government is making all of the economic decisions. And so, if you go to North Korea, this is the flag of North Korea, you'll live in a command economy where the government tells the producers what to make, they tell the producers how to make it, and they tell the company who they're making the product for. In a command economy, people have very, very little, if any, freedoms when it comes to economic choice. The next type of economy is often referred to as a market economy, sometimes referred as to the system of capitalism or free enterprise. A market economy is the complete opposite of a command economy. In a market economy, instead of the government having control, the people have control. And getting more specific, what we're looking at here are the buyers and the sellers. The buyers are the people purchasing goods, and the sellers are the companies making the goods. People are trying to buy something for as cheap as possible, while businesses are trying to make as much money as possible. And here you have this tug of war. When it comes to determine what to produce, well, a business is going to produce something based upon what the consumer wants. For instance, if you think about iPods or CD players, which products are businesses making more of today? iPods, or CD players. How to produce something. Businesses are trying to make something that is of quality, usually. However, businesses are also trying to be cost effective. They don't want to spend too much money making their product, because if they spend too much money making their product, then they're going to have to make the price of the product really expensive. And the last question is for whom to produce. And depending upon how much money a consumer has, that's going to determine who's buying the good. Now, in the United States of America, we are not easy. We don't make it easy for you all. We have a mixed market economy. And what that means is we have a mix of command economy. We also have a little bit of market economy. If you look in this awesome picture over here, you'll see that you have a government inspector, and he's inspecting the quality of the meat. Now, here is the government making sure that the meat is safe, because if the meat is not safe, then the store that sells the meat is going to infect and hurt the people buying the meat. And so what you often have here is you have a mix of the government regulating the products that are being sold in order to protect people. So when it comes to what to produce, business owners get to decide what to produce, but oftentimes the government regulates what the businesses can produce. How to produce something, once again, business owners get to decide how to produce something, but the government sticks its nose in there in order to prevent companies from making products that are unsafe or could possibly hurt its customers, us. And the last question, for whom to produce, depending upon what the customer wants and needs, that determines for whom the company is making the product for. However, government does regulate for whom to produce. Because if you think about it, many customers might want to purchase alcohol or cigarettes, but the government says, wait a minute, you've got to be 18 to purchase cigarettes, you have to be 21 to purchase alcohol. Even though the customer might want to purchase those products, the government has its regulations, its rules that prevent people from doing whatever they want in order to protect us. Going a little bit further into the United States' mixed market economy, I wanted to show you a few examples of how we see mixed market economy taking place in the United States. The first example here is the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And what the FDA does, one of the main responsibilities of the FDA is to approve the use of pharmaceutical drugs, to test them and make sure that they're safe before people buy them, so people don't get hurt, so people don't die. The second type of involvement that the government has in our economy is social services. So if you've ever heard of the concept minimum wage, social security, Medicaid, food stamps, all of these services are government provided. However, they're trying to step in for the private markets to help people who cannot always provide for themselves. And another way the government in the United States incorporates mixed market is the fact that the U.S. government spends billions and billions of dollars on military spending. How that works is you have private companies that make the products, and then the government takes its money and purchases these products from the private companies. And so here you have a mix of the market, the consumers, and the sellers, and the government purchasing products from these sellers. We are officially done with Unit 1, and now we're going to be moving on to Unit 2. And in Unit 2, we're going to be looking at the principles that make up our Constitution, the guiding rules that make up how our national government and sometimes how our state governments are run. we're going to look at 6 guiding principles that shape the United States government. Some teachers like to incorporate sometimes less than 6 principles. Sometimes teachers go with 7, 8, or 9. We're going to stick to the 6 that come up the most on the HSA. Well, that's what I think. We're going to be talking about the concept of popular sovereignty, federalism, rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, and judicial review. Some of these are words we talked about in Unit 1. Some of these are items we haven't talked about, though we've kind of touched on them. And a couple of these are going to be brand new, or hopefully not brand new, but a little bit more intensive review for some of you. The first principle we're going to be looking at is the concept called popular sovereignty. And the word popular means people. And the word sovereignty means power or controller. And so if you take popular and sovereignty and put them together, you get people power. And how do people exercise their power in the United States of America? Well, one of the most important ways is through elections, if you're a citizen, if you're not a convict or in jail in some states. And another way that sometimes people demonstrate their power is through demonstrations. And you'll notice here that these people are being peaceful in their protest at the White House, protesting the economy or war or whatever they want. Second, we're going to be looking once again at the concept of federalism. And some of you are like, we've already seen federalism. Good, you're going to see it again, because federalism is really important and it comes up a lot on the HSA. Federalism, as if you know or should know, or we'll review for you, is the idea that power is divided and shared between the national, state, and local governments. So you'll notice how sometimes we get these concurrent powers, powers that are shared. For instance, in the amendment process, it's up to Congress to propose amendments. However, states must ratify amendments before an amendment officially becomes part of our Constitution. A power specifically given to the federal or national government. Don't get confused. Federal, national, central, they all mean the same thing. The federal government is responsible for printing money. And that state governments are responsible for licenses. And many of you care most about are driver's licenses. However, if you want to get a marriage license, if you want to get a license to be an accountant, if you want to get a license to be a beautician or be a hairdresser, you go through the state, not the national government. It's important to know. One of the other reasons it's important to know about federalism is it's important to know who to complain to. If you don't like what's going on in terms of America's foreign policy, you need to know that you need to complain at the federal level. If you don't like the way your school is being run, or you think the school needs more money or better teachers, you don't want to complain to the president. You want to complain to the state or local government, because the state or local government has the power to fix your problem. In this diagram, you have images showing the amendment process. And just to go over something real quick, the word amend means to change or to modify or to alter. So when we amend the Constitution, we are changing it up a bit. It's very hard to amend the Constitution. First, it takes a proposal to make an amendment. And the only people that can make a proposal are Congress. And Congress, you should know Congress, is at the national government. If 2/3 of Congress proposes an amendment, then the amendment goes to the states. And it's up to the states to then ratify an amendment. If 3/4 of all state legislatures vote to ratify an amendment, then the amendment becomes part of the Constitution.
we haven't had a new amendment added to the Constitution since about 1992. So it's been a while, and the reason why it's been a while is because you have to have so many Democrats and so many Republicans at both the national and state government in agreement to make an amendment. And as many of you might know, it can be very, very hard to get a lot of Democrats and Republicans to agree to just about anything. Next, we're going to be looking at the concept called rule of law. Rule of law is real simple. This is one of the main principles that makes America different from many other countries. If you grew up in a developing nation, say you grew up in the country of Sierra Leone, or maybe in El Salvador, you might be under the assumption that a government official or a police officer can do whatever the heck they want. They don't have to worry about going to jail or paying a punishment. What makes the United States different is that we have this concept called rule of law. And what that means is no matter who you are, no matter how powerful you may be, all the laws apply to all the people. So even the president has to pay taxes, just like us. Even if the president commits a crime, he's got to go to court, he's got to prove himself innocent. The president could possibly go to jail. One of the most famous cases of a president almost getting impeached and kicked out was Richard Nixon and the Watergate incident, but that's too much history for you. You can learn more about that in EP government. Earlier, we were learning about how in the United States we have something called a presidential democracy. And what gives us a presidential democracy is the fact that the power of our government is divided. The power of our government is divided into a legislative branch that makes laws. That's the Capitol with its rotunda, famous rotunda. That's where the House and Senate are. They make laws. Next, you have the executive branch, and the executive branch in this beautiful house here. This is the White House. In the executive branch, the president and his cabinet and regulatory agencies enforce laws. And what that means is, to enforce a law means that if people don't follow a law, if people abuse a law, it's up to the executive branch to make sure people are punished. Because if people are not worried about being punished, people are going to do whatever the heck they want, and then you get chaos. Sometimes there is confusion about a law. Sometimes people might think a law or a government action is illegal, and therefore you get the judicial branch, and it's up to the judicial branch to interpret laws. We're going to look at many Supreme Court cases like Marbury versus Madison, Brown versus Board of Education, where you have the judicial branch that interprets laws, that decides if something is unconstitutional or illegal. Checks and balances is one of the most important principles of the United States government, as well as state and local governments. The idea here is that we have three branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial. We talked about that under the separation of powers. However, what makes our government very unique is that each of these branches has power over the other branch. For instance, Congress, or the legislative branch, has the power to write laws. However, before these laws actually become laws, before these bills become laws, the executive branch has the power to either veto a law, which means to reject a law, or the power to sign a law. And how that works is Congress passes a bill, if the president likes the bill, the president signs the bill, and the bill becomes law. The courts, though, have one of the most important powers and one of the most misunderstood powers. Courts have the power to declare any bill, any law, unconstitutional, meaning the courts have the power of judicial review, the power to look at a bill and decide if it's unconstitutional, doesn't follow the Constitution. And if the court thinks a bill is unconstitutional, the court can wipe that bill away just like it didn't exist. The purpose of checks and balances is not to make the branches equal, because the branches aren't equal. Each branch has different power. The key here is that checks and balances makes our three branches balanced in terms of power, meaning that each branch isn't more powerful than the other branch. And finally, we've come to the last principle of the United States government, the concept of judicial review. In judicial review, if you look at the two words, judicial and the word review, the word judicial refers to courts, and the word review means to review something, to look something over. And that's really what judicial review is. You have a court, a neutral body of people, and this neutral, non-biased party of people are deciding if a government is doing something that is illegal or unconstitutional. A very important thing that you have to know about judicial review is the fact that a very important court case created judicial review. This court case is called Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison, the court decided that the Supreme Court has the power to throw out any law it seems violates the Constitution. If you look at this cartoon on the right, you'll notice how the Supreme Court is sitting pretty high above the Capitol, which represents the legislative branch, and the Supreme Court is sitting pretty high over the White House, which represents the executive branch, or the president. The size of the images should mean something to your brain. The size of the images should say to you, the Supreme Court is a lot more powerful according to this cartoonist. And the reason why this cartoonist is saying the Supreme Court is so powerful is because the court can strike down something illegal that the legislative branch does. The Supreme Court can strike down something illegal that the executive branch does, or the White House does. One of the most famous examples of judicial review is another important court case called Brown versus Board of Education. And what happened here was that the Supreme Court looked at all of these segregation laws that happened, not just in the South, but also in the North. And the Supreme Court said, look, all of these laws that separate people by race, especially in schools, violate the 14th Amendment. Segregation does not give people equal protection under the law. Therefore, the Supreme Court wiped out and said that all schools had to integrate. All public places had to integrate racially. Here you have the Supreme Court telling the legislative branch and the executive branch at the state and national level they had to do something. They had to make a change. That's a very important power. That's a really powerful responsibility. The last and one of the most important principles that kind of sums up the United States government is the concept of limited government. And you all know what limits are. Limits are restrictions on what you can do. Teenagers